So good evening, Ed, and good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to have you here. It's an absolute delight, really, to have you with us, and a real honour for me to be hosting you this evening for our Call to Europe, which is our 10th anniversary edition as well. My name is Charlotte Billingham. I'm FEP's Senior Policy Advisor working on climate here. And of course, Ed MILIBAND is here joining us, who is Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK, and of course also Labour MP for Doncaster North, which is also my neck of the woods. So it's really great to have you here again, to see you again. And we're going to be discussing accelerating and delivering on the green recovery. But we also want this to be very much a conversation. So I want everybody also to prepare your questions as well. We're going to, if we have the chance, answer as many questions as we can, hopefully in the time allowed. So please, if you don't know where the question box is, it's here on the platform. On the left, it's a little question mark box. And if you're following us on Facebook, then please just put it in the chat and we'll be transferring these questions to Ed. And while you're thinking of your questions, if I could just take this moment to have a quick selfie, please, and we'll just take a screenshot before we start. So while everybody's considering the really provocative questions that you're going to be asking, Ed, now, hang on a minute. I'll do a 1, 2, 3. Hang on. 1, 2, 3. Cheese. There we go. Great. Thank you. So we've got about 45 minutes for the discussion. It is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. So big shout out to everybody who's here with us on the platform and who's joining us on Facebook. We can't see you, but we can feel your presence, so we know you're there. I just got a, I don't know, I just got a little notification. I'm not sure.
So did I, actually, Charlotte, if it's any consolation.
Okay. We'll just carry on anyway. So the Twitter hashtags as well, if you want to show your presence there, is Call to Europe and Inequalities and Mind the Gaps. But first,
Laszlo Andor briefly appeared on my screen, but he disappeared.
Oh, well, he's welcome to join again if he wishes. So maybe Laszlo wants to ask a question as well once we get into the conversation. But basically, yeah, this Call to Europe is the 10th anniversary edition, but it also marks the start of what scientists consider to be the most defining 10 years in the future of our planet. And there may be no other chance like the present to ensure a systemic shift in our commitments towards carbon neutrality. And of course, we have the EU Green Deal led by Frans Timmermans. We also have within that the EU climate law and also national climate laws, which are being implemented and offer really, really positive developments. But there is still a huge gap in what needs to be done. And so the type of recovery and the legislative frameworks that allow the climate ambition will make a really big difference. And also one of the crucial elements that we often highlight is the need to garner wider public support to enable and accelerate climate ambition, which is also very important. But as the key architect of the 2008 UK Climate Act, which helped pave the way for the Paris Agreement, Ed Miliband is very much one of the most recognised political players currently on the scene for helping us accelerate and deliver on the green recovery, I would say. And also, of course, with the COP26 in Glasgow this year with UK hosting, this is going to be a really key moment. So this session is going to look very much at the importance of the summit, as well as what other key developments we need to be looking at, basically. And my first question for you, Ed, actually was inspired when we spoke back in January at the FEPS Fabian New Year's conference. And you said that the COVID pandemic has taught us even more why we must follow the science. So therefore, my first question is, the next few years are going to be the most crucial and challenging concerning reaching the target set out in the Paris Agreement. So what do you think needs to happen in order to ensure that efforts are maximised and at the rate that science is telling us that we need to move? Thank you.
Well, Charlotte, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this session. I'm really delighted to be here to pay tribute to the work of FEPS, which is incredibly important work that you do, and to your Call to Europe. And also, it's a great pleasure to have the chance to chat to you again, as we did earlier this year. I mean, look, here's the way I think about it from a UK perspective. When I think about I know you want to ask me about the UK. When I think about what we're doing in terms of what the government is doing in terms of its targets are better than other countries, some other countries, so relatively positive in that sense. But no country is doing enough. And I suppose that's my starting point for my answer to your question, which is I've got on the whiteboard in my office, which makes me sound like a real nerd, which I am, the gigaton numbers that we are heading for with the Paris commitments, which is 53 to 55 gigatons in 2030. What we need to be at 2 degrees in terms of gigatons in 2030, 40, and what we need to be at 1.5 degrees to get to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is 24 or 25 gigatons. Now, never mind sort of the specifics of the gigatons. That gives you a sense of the scale of the task we have. So my answer to your question is we've got to be pushing for maximum ambition from the US, maximum ambition from China, maximum ambition from the EU, maximum ambition from the UK. If I was in the UK negotiator's shoes, I'd be saying, look, we should be willing to go further on our 2030 target, even further. I think we're at 68%. Below 1990, if it can persuade others to move, because this is what I mean about the relatives and absolutes. We can't negotiate with the science. We know what the science is telling us. So firstly, maximum ambition. Secondly, in pursuit of that ambition, green recovery. I think what Biden is doing in the US, what some of our European colleagues are doing, is a really good exemplar of this recognition of green recovery as a way out of the economic crisis of the pandemic and to deal with climate as the next emergency. And I'm afraid the UK is not stepping up to the mark as it should on that. So that's the sort of second element of it. Thirdly, crucially, finance for developing countries. Because unless we both for there's this $100 billion finance that we've talked about since Copenhagen for developing countries. But the truth about the 100 billion, when you look at the numbers for adaptation, I mean, some estimates are that developing countries are going to face $300 billion worth of adaptation costs by 2030. So the 100 billion is a trust issue, but it's not enough. And so I think thirdly, there's got to be, plus the impact of COVID on developing countries. So the combination of, debt relief, finance for developing countries to make the climate transition, obviously help in terms of vaccines, greater help in terms of vaccines is the third element. And then I suppose the last element, and I suppose this is, maybe partly the point of this event, is how is all this going to happen? Even with the COVID constraints, we do need more of a social movement mobilization than we have at the moment around COP26, because I think leaders have got to feel the pressure more than they're feeling. They've got to feel the pressure of that spotlight of, are they going to deliver or are they not going to deliver? And the thing about these international conferences is it's kind of, I find in the UK, even explaining what it's actually supposed to achieve, which is this ratchet effect post-Paris, which is to close the gap between the high-level ambitions of Paris, 1.5 degrees, and the Paris pledges, even that requires greater public awareness. So I think there's lots to do, but the watchword has got to be ambition and the science.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ambition and science, I like that. At least we're starting on a very good path. Then, if I may ask also, though, to what extent do you think the UK is ready and is regarded as a credible player internationally? You mentioned that we need to make sure that the UK and other countries really have maximum ambition. And this is on climate and energy policy. To what extent do you think then we can enable and secure a successful COP?
I mean, I think it's paradoxical. At one level, internationally, if you look back and you look at where we're at, the UK has been relatively successful. We're 42% below 1990 levels in terms of emissions. We have decoupled growth and carbon emissions. We are more or less phasing out coal. We have some things to the way renewables have taken off is really good. We have the climate change act in place, which I passed. So there's some good elements to it. Why I think we're good people to be hosts. There's some things that worried me about what the government is doing, to be honest. I mean, I think the cut in overseas aid, we got to 0.7, we got cross-party consensus of 0.7, and they've cut now to 0.5. It's terrible. And it's completely the opposite to what we need to be doing, as I've said publicly. I think we are better at the government is much better at the targets than they are at the delivery, and they're not really stepping up on green recovery. So, but I want this summit to succeed. I think we are good people to be hosts of this. But the most important thing I really want from government is the high level attention that it needs from the Prime Minister. This is I think I've compared this in the past to 190 dimensional chess. This is like 190 something countries, the COP. And it requires the hard yards of diplomacy and really knowing what your objectives are and what you're trying to actually get out of it. And, we've got to be the persuaders for maximal ambition. And my slogan for the summit will be keep 1.5 alive. I mean, it's got to show a credible path to keeping 1.5 degrees alive. Because we know the dangers we're already facing, so many countries are facing, all of us, from the global warming that we've already got in place. So that's got to be what the government does. And, I want to support them. I talked to Alok Sharma, the president of the COP, not just sort of publicly, but privately. It's in all our interests that they succeed.
Yeah. I mean, I think the actual slogan of the COP is "Together for our planet," which sometimes seems a little bit cynical when we look at how the vaccination rollout is going, as you say, in developing countries. So something that we need to be thinking about. But indeed, it does offer the hope of solidarity that it should do, and hopefully then that can be followed. You mentioned the green recovery. Perhaps you would like to tell us a bit about, in this session, what Labour's vision for the green recovery is.
Definitely. And this is, I think, so key to this. The UNEP emissions gap report, which points out the gap between what the pledges of Paris are and the gap with the high level ambition. One of the things they said is a quarter of that gap could be closed by a global green recovery. Their most recent report. And so we've been arguing here for a green stimulus, an economic stimulus, which really steps up. And that, the thing that always strikes me about this, Charlotte, is there is so much work needing to be done as part of this climate transition in this country, and indeed right across the world, whether that is about manufacturing the electric vehicles or putting in the charging points or creating the green spaces, because trees are part of the natural solution to this, or sort of rethinking towns and cities to be more favorable to walking and cycling, or the power sector and renewables. These are the jobs of the future. Now, I think there is a sort of understanding of this at a high level in government, but I've been home insulation too. I think there's a sort of danger that the rhetoric is just not matched by the reality. And so my point to government is, look, step up to actually not just talk the talk, but really walk the walk in terms of what you do. We've said as a starting point, a £30 billion green recovery over the next 18 months. It's what I think similar to levels to what we see in France and Germany. The government is not at that level. And of course, if you look at what Biden is doing, and of course the US has been further behind, what he's proposing anyway is something like $1 trillion over 10 years. So I think it's going big. It's going big in relation to that question, and I think the public get this, because I think the public want good jobs and decent jobs at good wages. And I think we've got on the left, we've got a real challenge here, which is to talk about the climate emergency as a threat, because it is a threat, but also to talk about our vision of what kind of society we can create. You know, we want people to have warmer, decent homes. We want to cut air pollution, which is a massive and silent killer. We want people to have access to the green spaces. We don't want to replace the high carbon unjust world with the low carbon unjust world. And we've got to do both together. And I think this is the big understanding of the so-called Green New Deal. And obviously we're seeing what France is doing in Europe, and you know, what is being done elsewhere. I mean, I think it's this notion that yes, we're about the climate emergency. As much, though, as we step up to the climate emergency, we are about reshaping our societies so they are fairer, more equitable, with decent jobs for people, decent, good-paying jobs for people. And I think that is a compelling vision which unites, if you like, the people who are worried about the climate emergency, but are also worried about the here and now.
Yeah, and I think this is also actually bringing us very much into something that we've been working on at FETS recently. We have a project that's looking at how progressives, or how the left should talk about green issues. Well, we haven't obviously finished our work yet, but the insights are very interesting, and definitely something that you mentioned is that we've been discussing is how much do you talk about it as an emergency? So like the kind of, but some people then get very scared about the kind of alarmist language and don't appreciate that, and a bit of the kind of extinction rebellion. Is it hurting or harming? As we know that was very controversial, the protest that took place in London and elsewhere and around the world. But I see that there's questions coming, so I'm going to move on. And actually, before I see Laszlo's very provocative question, I'll ask you that later. But somebody in the chat, Chris Barles, wants to ask also on this question of how to enable citizens to participate in the push towards the green energy. And I think that this is a really important question, because it's how do you get on board a wider, you know, from our work as well, we know that we need support for climate policies in order for them to go faster, to accelerate climate policies. So, and at the moment, though, it's seen very much as a kind of white middle class issue. So how do we get wider support for climate issues and also engage people in those discussions and include them in the kind of co-design and co-creation of the policies, and also of things that are probably happening in their area? And like you say, you mentioned jobs earlier, but perhaps you want to expand on that.
You know, I think it's really interesting, this. And I'm partly influenced by my own constituency in Doncaster. I chaired a commission for Doncaster, which is the town where I'm an MP, a town of about 300,000 people, at the request of the mayor. And across all political parties, across civil society, across business, people are massively up for this. You know, it doesn't need to be simply a middle class issue, this. If we say to people, look, this is about your local green spaces, this is about good jobs for you and your kids, this is about, you know, electric cars, decent public transport, good bus services, good rail services, about helping you, you know, get around. I mean, there is a vision here. You know, there is definitely a vision. I'd be really interested to know about your FEPS research on this. But I think we have to accept that we have a danger, which is that as we go about this transition, if we don't put, and this is the role of progressives, I think, if we don't put social justice and economic justice at the center of this, we won't succeed. Because people will say, well, it's a transition, but it's not a transition that's going to help me. Or it's a transition that I'm going to lose out. We see this issue in relation to cars in this country, which is, you know, the question I'm asking and the argument I'm putting to government is, okay, let's make the transition on 2030, phase out petrol and diesel cars. Let's make these cars, electric cars, affordable for people. Let's put in place a decent public transport. Let's have the charging points, because otherwise people are going to say, well, you know, you're asking, you know, me to pay for this transition and it's not affordable for me. So I think this is you know, it's interesting, this idea that people sometimes talk about individual change. What are you doing? You know, are you green? Are you, you know, doing the right things? And that's an important question. But I always think system change makes possible individual change. If we put in place the right systems and the right incentives, then individuals will make the right choices. But if we don't, and if people think they're going to lose out, and look, the great thing is we've got this independent climate change committee, which advises government, which was part of the Climate Change Act. And they're saying, look, quite soon electric cars, the lifetime cost will be less than the cost of petrol cars. Now, the upfront cost may be still higher, but that's where government comes in to make it affordable for people.
Yeah. Okay. And just on that, though, I think there is some instance that, like you know, what's going on at COP, and you mentioned at the beginning, you've got your whiteboard with the gigatons and things like that, and it's like you say, it's often very geeky and very techy or technical. So how can, I think often people feel that there's a lot of jargon that perhaps is difficult to translate into real life tangible policies, like you say, whether it's about heating your home or having the incentive to buy solar panels and things like that. So this is very much what our research is going to be looking into. And I should mention also, it's with the Fabian Society as well in the UK, of course, and with the Irish partners. So we will be keeping you aware of that. I'm going to move on to the next questions. There is one, well, moving on to that, actually, on the question of Laszlo. So Laszlo Onda says, is beef a real problem or a distraction?
Thanks for that.
This is, of course, very much how do you talk about...
I'd like to let Laszlo answer this question first.
I don't know if Laszlo can join us.
He may not want
to answer in the chat.
Laszlo, what's your answer? Really nice to see you, Laszlo. What's your answer?
You're muted, Laszlo.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I would accept the Said answer, which is it depends how much beef we eat. But besides, I think this question is also about how deeply we have to go into changing daily habits, including eating habits of ordinary people. Because then I think a kind of more general cultural change would need to be organized somehow beyond, macro planning numbers.
But, I think it's really interesting, this, Laszlo, because here in this country, there is a real trend towards what I think is called flexitarianism, which is, people eating much more vegetarian food, not necessarily going wholly vegetarian yet, but becoming more people going vegetarian, more people eating less meat. I saw, and actually it's interesting that the supermarkets are now starting to, I think one supermarket recently announced that it was cutting the cost of its vegan or vegetarian food. So I sort of think this is one of these issues where, and I think we do have to be careful on this, where I think cultural change is starting to happen, and I think government can encourage it. I'm much more in the, no pun intended, in the carrot rather than the stick department on this. In other words, I very, very against, people talk about meat taxes and all that. And honestly, I think the problem with all that is that if we do this in a way that penalizes people, particularly lower income people, we are really not going to take people with us. But I think there is a chance to, the health case is strong for eating less meat. Obviously, the climate case is strong, and I think this is sort of where people are going. I think it's, by the way, I think it's interesting on electric cars as well, that as we are recovering from the pandemic, at least in the UK, we have seen not enough, but we have seen a big upswing in the number of people trying to go get electric cars. And this, I think, is the point that people want to do the right things. The question is, partly what's the economics and partly public information. I don't know whether that fits with what you think, Laszlo.
Thank you.
I think the larger question is perhaps also very relevant for how climate issues are conveyed in political conversations as well. And I think the beef one has been very relevant towards the US discussions recently. But this brings, what you've just said, Ed, brings us on to a question from Laura Rayner here. So how do you think we can ensure greater ambitions on the green transition won't result in greater social inequalities?
I mean, I would say to Laura, and maybe this makes me hopelessly optimistic and naive, I would say that it can result in greater equality. You know, just think about this issue of housing. We've got to, in the UK, change the way we heat tens of millions of homes. Now, in order to make this a sort of doable, we've got to both insulate the homes better and then change the way we heat them. And all this is doable. It's got cost, and government's got to work out how it organizes that cost in a fair way. But there's a real opportunity. You know, we have a massive fuel poverty problem in this country. We have massively drafty, badly insulated homes, poor housing. There's a huge opportunity here if we are imaginative about it. There's a huge opportunity here. I sort of think that the problem in the end is not a technical problem. It's a sort of imagination, political will problem. Is that if we have the political will and the imagination to do this, we can. And look, the way governments have reacted, no two crises are the same, but the way governments have reacted to the COVID crisis shows that if something needs doing, governments can step up. And so I would say to Laura, you know, not just on housing, we can definitely make our societies fairer as a result of this this transition. And we've got to make our societies fairer because it's the right thing to do. We won't take people with us if we don't.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question. So the questions are rolling in now, which is great. We've got another one here in the chat from Victor Sakesi. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong, but he asks, how can we connect the fight against the climate catastrophe and the push for democratization of the economy, i.e. workers' representation in the economy? And is this an issue at all in your view?
I think it's a really good point. And we definitely want more worker, at least certainly in the UK, we want more worker voice in our economy. And that is really important. And, you know, power at work is a massive issue. And I think then related to that, and again, it's maybe a particular UK issue, I think, we've got to make sure that the green industries of the future are also strong, unionized, well-paying jobs. Because part of the challenge we face in relation to fossil fuel jobs is that lots of them are unionized, and although hazardous in some cases, are decently paid. And so what we can't do, and I know this from my experience as a constituency MP in Doncaster, we can't replace, because we had the coal mines that all closed here, we can't replace the decently paid fossil fuel jobs with not so well paid green jobs. We've got to show that these can be well-paying, unionized jobs. And so I think the question, and the question about the role of workers and worker voice in this economy it seems to me to be absolutely crucial. Because look, the other thing is, if we engage workers in companies, we can make this transition. The only way this transition works is with the engagement of people. This isn't something that can be just delivered by pulling levers. It's got to be delivered by working with people, so I think this question is bang on. And I'm, by the way, maybe through your good offices, Charlotte, I'd be really interested in sort of other examples from around Europe of where this worker voice issue is being kind of, you know, done in a good way.
So that's a call out to everyone. We want to hear examples of where the workers are being included in decisions more effectively. And I think that relates very much to what we would hope to expect and hope to see as well more from the Just Transition policies as well, and how they can really engage and actually benefit the workers, which is what we really hope the Just Transition mechanism can do. I have another question here from Alina George, I don't see the end of your name, I'm sorry. here in the chat that talks about what's happening on the border of Europe today with with Russia or Belarus, and she asks, in the context of regional threats, will other questions be put as a priority and the Green Project come last? So this is very important, I think, for what's happening today in the news. If you want to talk about that.
Being appalled by the situation in terms of Belarus and what we've seen, and I think it's caused shock around Europe and indeed around the world. This is sort of where I'm maybe kind of not exactly less optimistic, but I think it is important to have some realism about the challenge. You know, this is the ultimate. Well, I was going to say the ultimate collective action problem, but I mean the pandemic is also a collective action problem. But you know, this along with the pandemic is such a collective action problem. You know, we need everyone to step up and be part of this, and they can't. You know, I mean, at least as far as the major emitters are concerned, we need everybody on board, and this is really, really hard. I mean, I think this is really hard. That's the sort of sober point. I think the more optimistic thought is, you know, people know the Copenhagen summit didn't go very well, to put it with British understatement. What went wrong at Copenhagen? There's lots of things you can point to, but one of the things that was problematic was there just wasn't the political will to act. You know, Europe was getting its act together, but China, the US, Obama had just come in. China was, in my view, not that interested in acting at Copenhagen. You know, developing countries were, understandably, and still are, concerned about how much of the burden they were going to have to bear. I think the world is very different now. I think people have recognized that we really are in it together on this. And I think that is the reason for hope. And in the end, you know, I don't know what this looks like, Charlotte, but I think, you know, acting on this issue is going to have to become the permission slip for being in the international community. I mean, you're going to need to say to people that you just got to, you know, if you want to be accepted in the international community, you've got to act on this. You can't just be like, well, you know, we're going to free ride on your action and not going to bother ourselves because it's just too difficult for us. I used to have this conversation with my colleague and friend Todd Stern, who is the Obama climate envoy. You know, every country has compelling constraints, and the domestic constraints in different countries are different. You know, some it's going to be coal, some it's going to be other issues. You know, there's different constraints, and you've got to understand those compelling constraints. Sometimes you've got, you know, a party that's like strong climate deniers, and that puts constraints on. But so while understanding people's compelling constraints, you can't just say, well, you've got a free pass not to act. And we sort of know what the parameters are, which is you've got to be net zero sometime around 2050 at the latest, and you've got to take near-term action, because these net zero targets just in the future without near-term action between now and 2030 are not really much use. You can't sort of say, well, we're going to be at net zero in 40 years time or 30 years time, but we're not going to do anything in the meantime, because that's not credible, and it's not going to deal with the issue. So I think it's incredibly hard, but I think there are grounds for hope.
Okay, that's great. Just another question coming in from Henning here, who asks, well, he talks about how do you basically prepare workers from those jobs that might be changing in supporting climate action policies, whether it's the car industry or others, if I understand the question correctly.
Matt Henning,
how do you get those people on board?
What's Henning's surname?
I don't see it. I'm sorry.
Right.
I don't know if it's squashed on my screen. I'm sorry.
Oh, right, he's squashed. Well, it's a really good question. I would say this. Our slogan in this should be no worker left behind. And, we cannot leave workers behind in this process. And what are the elements of that? The elements of that are, it's got to be a planned transition, not an unplanned transition. So you can't just turn off fossil fuel jobs tomorrow. You've got to plan a transition. And that's really important. And I see that, honestly, take my word for it about what happened in, our coal mining communities in the UK. You know, Charlotte. So firstly, a planned transition, not an unplanned one. Secondly, that we've got to have a sense that the jobs that are no longer going to work in the new world, that the jobs replacing them are as good in terms of pay, conditions, rights at work, all of those things. So like for like replacement, and then thirdly, the best chance for retraining and help to get those jobs, so that you don't leave workers behind. I mean, there'd be the three things that I would, and then fourthly, it's like the slogan. I think it originally started in the disability movement. Never about us without us. I mean, we've got to have workers engaged in these discussions. You can't do it. And there's some really good trade union leaders in the UK who are really engaged on this green agenda. It's not easy. They recognise it's not easy, but they know they've got to work with their members to take them on a journey. But you can't have this done to people. It's got to be part of dialogue. We're actually just starting in the UK our own just transition body, but government isn't doing it. To engage in these discussions with trade unions and others, bring together the environmental wing of our movement and the trade union wing of our movement, which also is environmental, in these discussions. So I think that would be the way I would think about moving forward on this. It's not easy. I think there's some good examples, by the way. Spain, I think, has done really well on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think Spain's doing really well. A very interesting case happening in Spain, and especially the way that they're engaging with changing the regions that really are going to be the strongest hit, rather than creating jobs elsewhere, I should say. So another question from our dear Secretary General: do you think lowering the voting age will help make climate conscious decisions? And I think
I'm a vote 16. I'm a vote 16 guy, definitely. I think Austria has done it. I think Austria has been the trailblazer on it, is my understanding. But I'm totally I'm totally for this. And I think Laszlo asked about Greta. Has she been a game changer? I think Greta and the pupil climate strikers have made a big difference. But I think somebody else in the chat, Chris, is saying older people tend not to see the problem because they won't be here when the climate problems become even worse. But young people like Greta feel their voices are not heard. Does the older generation short-termism mean the problem will be not addressed? It's too late. Chris, that's the danger. I mean, we've all got to have even us older people like me, we've got to have the mindset of, a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 14-year-old in this, which is, you certainly can't think, well, I'm not going to be around to see it, so it's okay. I mean, what will future generations think of us? So I think we've got to have the psychology of, this is the decisive decade. I mean, I think this is the thing I keep coming back to, Charlotte, which is in a way the point of being in politics at the moment. There are lots of points of being in politics, but one of the points is all the other issues we face, we want to act on them as soon as we can. They're incredibly urgent. They're matters of life, particularly matters of life and death. There is also something unique about the climate thing, which is the decisions we make now will have generational effects for a long time to come. We won't be able to put the genie back in the bottle if we spend the next 10 years like we spent the last 30.
Yeah, and I think also there was a big reminder of that recently in the with the recent ruling in Germany, which Luisa Neubauer was involved in, which basically ruled that how the country's climate change law is violating the rights by putting the burden of reducing emissions on young people. So there's a really compelling argument here on intergenerational justice, and of course we've definitely been following those discussions. But I think it's very interesting because these kind of cases are coming more and more often. There was the Urgenda campaign in the Netherlands. There was one in the UK, although I think it failed. But I think that we definitely haven't seen the rest of this. So it's very much, what do you think, I mean, about young people basically holding politicians to account on these issues in the next few years?
Definitely. I mean, definitely. You know, I'm going to do a shameless plug now. I've written this book called Go Big, which is coming out next week, actually, next Thursday. And I, in the story on young people and the role of young people, I cite this video, which you may have seen, of these young people in Senator Dianne Feinstein's office. I strongly recommend you watch this video, because they basically, Dianne Feinstein, I don't know Dianne Feinstein well, but they gave her a really hard time. She's in her 80s. And the young people are just incredibly compelling, because they're just sort of saying, look, you know, it's out of the world we're going to inherit, and you've got to act. And she's got the wisdom of, you know, somebody who's been in the Senate for a number of years and so on. But they've got the insight of young people. I think we've got to listen to young people in this. I mean, I think young people have got to be at the center of these demands, because, you know, their voices really, really matter. I mean, they matter across the board, but they really particularly matter in this. They particularly matter.
Yeah, just on that, I should mention, Maria is putting it in the chat, but she's worked very much on Vote 16, and we've also done some work on intergenerational solidarity as well last year, and also in the climate context. And we're always discussing with our European senior organisation as well, with our young organisations. Please go.
I'm sure your work is really good. I don't think that most older people, maybe I'm partly speaking for myself here, but I don't think we want to leave a planet to young people that's completely, you know, sort of the parts of which are uninhabitable, all of these problems. You know, we do care about our legacy, I think.
Yeah. And well, I don't know if there's any more questions in the chat, but otherwise my main question is really, if you have now, well, you know, this is our Call to Europe conference, so this is meant to be a dialogue between institutions and the citizens. But if you had a call to Europe or call to the institutions or the government, what would it be?
Well, again, at the risk of a shameless plug, I would say sort of go big. I mean, you know, that should be our, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think that should be our rallying cry. Look, the truth is that the crises of inequality, of climate, of the recovery from COVID are so great that the notion that incremental small changes can solve the challenges we face, I just think is just completely wrong. And, you know, we have an obligation to rethink how our societies work. And we have an obligation to think about them, to rethink the way they work economically, to rethink the way they work in terms of sustainability, in terms of equality. And we can do all these things together. And I think the best hope for progressives, and I think progressives are the best hope for our countries, the best hope for us is to present people with a big and compelling vision. And I think part of the problem, honestly, Charlotte, of the last decade or more has been that the pernicious right has not just owned hatred and division and all of the things that we know about, but they've also owned people's pain and suffering in this economy. And the fact that people have felt like the economy is not working for them, at least I speak about the UK. And we've got to own that. Because if we don't own that big change, then other forces that we really don't like, and we're right not to like, will own that. And I think we've got to present a hopeful vision for how we can, you know, I sort of say in the book, you know, we made our institutions, we can remake our institutions. And I think that there is I think that is very much actually in the European ideal and the European spirit. So I sort of think, you know, optimism, not false optimism, but optimism about what we can do as progressives, aided by organizations like FEPS, to really answer the call of this moment and the challenges of this moment. And I really do think we can.
Okay, that's very nice. And our running theme is often 3 Ps: progressive, participatory, and above all positive. So
I like the 3 Ps.
Yeah, good. Thought you might. But well, I think that's the end of our session today. We've run out of time, but thank you so much, Ed. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you. I also want to thank everyone for joining, and do join us in an hour and 15 minutes from now, because we've got another session on digital and the digital in the welfare age, welfare in the digital age, sorry. And also tomorrow and Thursday, we've got other sessions of a really packed programme. And also, if you miss any of these, we've got the recordings that you'll be able to catch online soon. But for now, thank you very much, Shadow Minister Ed. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much for your valuable insights. You've given us plenty of things to talk about, and especially in how we can achieve accelerating and delivering on a green recovery. Laszlo, would you like to say some words as well?
Just thank you both, because it has been a very good conversation and we learned a lot.
And thank you so much, Charlotte. It's great to have, we should go on our European tour, because it's great to talk to you.
I hope so, and I hope next time we might be able to get a copy of your signed book next time we see you.
And maybe even in person, Hopefully,
and maybe we can do a review of it on the Progressive Post magazine.
I'd love to do that.
Take care.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.